Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Thanks for taking time. We're going to talk with former governor of New York, George Pataki, coming up in just a little bit. First, I want to do a quick follow-up to yesterday's chat about why our brains need to find certainty, right? They need conclusions. It needs to land on something, anything, even if what a brain lands on makes no sense, because our brains are very uncomfortable with uncertainty, because uncertainty means we're not safe. So our brains desperately trying to make sense of what's going on. And truth doesn't matter to our brains. It matters to our souls. Truth matters to our souls, but not to our brains. Our brains need something. Think of your brain as it's drowning. It's literally drowning in uncertainty, desperately grasping for something and then grab on whatever it can. Even if it won't help them stay afloat, even if it's like, I gotta grab onto a piranha and it bites them back. It doesn't matter. Brain doesn't care in the moment of panic. It needs to grab onto anything and it will. We were talking to Dan Crenshaw the other day on the show, Congressman, and he had this great line. He said, calm breeds calm. Panic breeds panic. In SEAL training, he talks about in his new book called Fortitude. He talks about how when they tie part of the training is they tie your hands and your arms behind your back and they tie your feet together and they throw you in a pool. We'll talk about this more in the next segment. It's called drown proofing. They drown proof you. But fast forwarding, the whole point of this is you have to stay calm in the midst of almost drowning. You need to stay calm. And I want to share this truth here, because this is a time that, like this COVID pandemic, is a time that could cause panic. But it requires us to stay calm. And I love truths like this, because the first rebuttal I'm going to hear after I share this is, oh, Slater, easy for you to say, I'm in this terrible situation here, and I can't stay calm. But a good truth like this, it's more true the more difficult your situation is. So the more likely one is likely to say, oh, that truth doesn't apply to me because, it's a good sign that it even more applies to you because. So here's the short of it. Back in ancient times and really popular in medieval times, there was what they called a Wheel of Fortune. That's where the game comes from. It's called Rota Fortunae, Wheel of Fortune. I think we had some old paintings of it here. And it was a symbol. See, there's Lady Fortune in the background, and she's spinning the Wheel of Fortune. And there's your fortune going up and down with Lady Fortune. And it was a symbol of just the unpredictable role of fate. There was a goddess Fortuna who would spin the wheel at random, and it could go either way for you. It could go really well, or it could go really poorly, depending where you are on the wheel. There's a ton of ancient literature on this, and maybe we can share more of it tomorrow. It's pretty interesting. But the name of time, Shakespeare wrote a lot about fortune, capital F, fortune. So Hamlet, right after the to be or not to be line, so to be or not to be is like literally live or not to live. Is it worth living? He goes on, he says, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. So is it better to live or die? Is it better to take the slings and arrows of life or to fight back against it? But fortune, he talks about fortune. Because life back then, the slings of outrageous fortune, right? Life back then, and life forever, was you do your best to survive, and then at any moment a plague sweeps through and kills all your kids. That happened. Or a plague comes through and just kills half the city. Or you're doing your best, and then there's some invasion from a neighboring region, and it kills all the men and takes all the women captive. And that's life. All right, how do you make sense of that? So one scene of Hamlet is talking to his best friend, Horatio. And he gives him an incredible compliment. It's one of the finest compliments certainly you could give back then, and I think it's still one of the finest compliments that someone could give today. I'm going to paraphrase, or I'm not going to do an exact quote. So Hamlet says, listen, Horatio, you're the best man I've ever known. And Horatio's like, come on, man. And he says, no, I'm not flattering you. I've chosen you as a friend because you take everything life hands you with calm acceptance, grateful for both good and bad. Blessed are those who mix emotion with reason in just the right proportion. That's my favorite part. We'll get to that in a second. Making them strong enough to resist the whims of Lady Fortune. Show me the person who's master of his emotions, and I'll put him close to my heart as I do to you. So that compliment there, finest compliment you could give is when a man or a person can take whatever life throws at them, wherever you end up on that wheel of fortune when Lady Fortune spins it, wherever you are, whatever the devil, whatever happens, you take it in stride. You don't get too emotional. But you're also not emotionless. That's my favorite part about it. You're not emotionless and cold. You can balance emotion with reason properly. And again, I love how the virtue is not no emotion. Emotion's good, but it needs to be balanced. This is a time right here, a friendly reminder now that we're, how many months into this thing, and we got many, many more months to go. This is a time that demands both. It demands emotion and reason. It demands patience and calm because it is a marathon. We are nowhere close to this thing being over. Do you know that, right? Like, I need to keep reminding myself of that. Every once in a while, it feels like, oh, we're reopening or something. Like, no. We are many, many months until this thing winds down in any real significant way. And in those many months, there's going to be a lot more cases and many more deaths. And the media is going to do this thing every time there's a new round number. The media loves round numbers for whatever reason. So it's going to be 75,000 deaths, 100,000 deaths, 150,000. Every time it's going to be this huge deal. It's like, yeah, that's going to happen. And we're not going to get emotional about it. We know how to balance it properly. That's the ultimate goal in the midst of it. I want to take a quick break. We're going to talk to George Pataki, former governor of New York, coming up in a little bit. But I want to take a quick second here and talk about drown proofing a little more from Dan Crenshaw's book. We'll do that next. Mike Slater, True Story. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, coming up next segment, we're going to talk to former governor of New York, George Pataki. But first, I want to talk a little more about this idea of drown proofing from the Navy SEALs. So I heard this a couple of years ago, and I thought I had it all figured. I had to figure out I've done Navy SEAL BUDS training before, right? But heard it a long time ago, and it made perfect sense when I heard what I'm going to share here. But there's a second half, which I just learned with Dan Crenshaw the other day. So the first part of drown proofing is they tie your hands behind your back, and they tie your feet together, and they throw you in a pool. They say, good luck, figure it out. So if someone did that to you, what would you do? How do you survive that? First, do you feel overwhelmed by it, like the prospect of it, or are you like, oh, geez, I don't know what I would? It's actually not that hard once you know what to do. So first thing is you stay calm. The very first thing, you have to stay calm. If you panic, you're done. You also have to go against every natural instinct in your body. Your brain is screaming at you, and you have to do the exact opposite and let yourself sink. You need to sink to the bottom of the pool. And to do that, you have to let all of your air out of your lungs. So as your body's desperately trying to get more oxygen, you need to let it all out. So you slowly let the air out of your lungs. You sink to the bottom, you push off the bottom of the pool, you come up to the surface, take a breath, and then you sink back down and you push off, and you just do that over and over, and you stay calm, and you can really do it all day. Like, no pressure, you're just taking deep breaths. It's like you can literally do it for hours and hours. Now, it's tricky, right? Like if you don't push off hard enough, then you don't make it to the top, and then you're in trouble, and if you push off too hard, then you kind of mess up the rhythm. So there's still potential problems there. And again, if you panic at any time in the entire process, then the whole thing is over. So I heard that years ago, and I loved that story, and it made perfect sense. And I love anything, remember the theme of the show is perhaps the opposite's true. So the idea that you have to do the opposite of what your instincts are in order to live, that's appealing to me. And about staying calm, staying focused, I love that story. For years, I've gone back to that, and I've thought about that. And then Crenshaw had to come in here and throw a loop in the whole thing and say, okay, yes, Slater, that's great. But what if someone ties your hands behind your back and your feet together and throws you in a body of water that's not a pool? What if someone throws you in the ocean and it's not 10 to 15 feet deep? And what if your goal is not just to survive, just bob up and down like a dope for forever, but what if you actually have to swim and go someplace with your arms tied behind your back and your feet tied together? Well, now I'm back to square one. Now I don't know. I don't know what to do. And now I'm freaking out again and panicking. So that's part two of drown proofing process, which I never considered. So Crenshaw, he writes about this in his book. So first thing, it's possible. It's possible to do. So float on your stomach and you do a dolphin kick. You do a dolphin kick, and then every once in a while when you just bob your head up, take a breath, kind of do a few more dolphin kicks, and you can propel yourself that way, even with your hands behind your back. He says it requires flawless execution to work. It also requires that you not panic. And imagine instructors screaming at the top of their lungs, "Don't panic," as you calmly try to do this. The slightest amount of panic will cause you to sink. And you aren't coming back up once you've sunk even a little bit. There's no method for swimming up once you've started to sink. I think you can see the life metaphor for that as well. So he goes through, in his book, he goes through all the book's called Fortitude. And by the way, I forgot to mention, you can watch our interview with him on our new app for your phone, for your iPhone and for your Android, for any phone, totally free app, and all the shows are right there. You can watch live, and then me, Jesse, Buck, Dana, everything's right there. Pick a day, boom, you can watch the whole thing, fast forward, all free. It's great, it's right there, it's easy, it's perfect, couldn't be any better. So you can download the free app on your phone. So if you want to go back just a couple days, you can watch the whole Dan Crenshaw interview. Anyway, so in his book, he talks about all the other things that they require these SEALs to do, which are just like ridiculous. Like you have to go scuba diving in the middle of the night in disgusting water, so you can't see like this far in front of you, and you have to like find stuff and fix it and bring it back. It's like all this like ridiculous, crazy stuff. But the point he makes is it's crazy stuff that has no relation to real life SEAling. Like you never do this, like a lot of this stuff in training you never actually do when you're a SEAL. So why do it? He said the goal is to force you to remain calm. Are you getting a theme of the show, of this segment here? The goal is to force you to remain calm and prepare for tasks in the worst of conditions when you can't breathe or see. There are many moments when this training comes in useful, for instance, in a gunfight. One could imagine that would be useful. And that's where he gets panic causes more panic, calm breeds calm. So we are drilled day after day to stay calm. And remember, we started talking about this because I brought up to Dan how he did an interview with Bill Maher the other day. And Bill Maher brought up some ridiculous claim, and Dan Crenshaw did such a good job of not only being curious, but staying calm. So this is part of his ethos, and it was drilled into him during BUD/S. The people who are going to make it out of COVID, or at least this first phase, actually we're kind of going into phase 2, I guess you could say. So let me talk in the past a bit. The people who made it out of the first phase the best were those who remained calm and who used it, no matter what the circumstance was, who used it as a time to grow. And again, as I mentioned before, I think with truth, the more difficult your circumstance, the more this is true, right? Like you're like, oh, Slater, this job, as a family member, I was sick, whatever. The more difficult the circumstance, the more important it is to stay calm. Dan Crenshaw will tell you that. So the people who made it out the best of phase 1 were the people who stayed the calmest and used it as a time to grow. And that's gonna be true for this second phase, whatever this is as well. I'll give you an example of this outside of the SEALs. So on our special for Friday, we're gonna talk to the owner and head chef of a local bakery here in San Diego. He called into my local radio show the other day, and he was so good. I was like, hey man, you gotta come on the TV show and give your message to our audience nationwide. But so we're gonna talk to him coming up on Friday, but I'll give you a quick preview. So he knew he had a lot of people relying on him, and his entire family, and also something like 30 employees. So that's reason to panic. Got life savings, people's livelihoods. You can panic during that. You'd think, but he didn't. He stayed calm. He's a calm guy, you'll see. And he came up with a whole new business model to save his business and to save his employees, keep his doors open, keep employees employed. His calmness led to creativity. And I hope it comes across on the TV like it did on the radio, we'll see, but he's just such a calm guy, and you can like see his brain like just working properly, right? It's just like humming on all cylinders, right? And that can only happen when you're calm. You're never creative or resourceful when you're panicking. No Navy SEAL has ever survived the drown-proofing tests freaking out. Impossible. Running around like a chicken with your head cut off is an expression for a reason. So stay calm. I think I've beaten that horse enough. Let me change gears a bit here, but similarly. And I want to introduce something here that we're going to talk a lot more about tomorrow, but it fits here. So let me do a little bit of it. So one of my favorite mental models to think about is the OODA loop. The OODA loop created by John Boyd, who's maybe the greatest fighter pilot in American history. 1961, he was 33. He wrote the, what's it called? Aerial Attack Study. The Aerial Attack Study, which codified dogfighting, how to win fighter pilot battles. And this is where he talked about this OODA loop. I think we have a chart for it here. Observe, orient, decide, and act. And notice it just keeps looping around in a circle over and over. Here's the most important thing about the OODA loop, before we give the cliff notes here and the fuller version tomorrow. It's entirely based on the reality that we live in a world of uncertainty. First of all, do you agree with that? Do you agree that we live in a world of uncertainty? Is today a time of uncertainty? Is this whole COVID thing a time of uncertainty? Of course, every single day we just say how no one knows anything about anything ever. That would be a definition of living in uncertainty. But Boyd's point would be that it's not the uncertainty that makes things so bad. It's our inability to properly make sense of the changing realities around us. So when circumstances change, and they always are, we're not quick enough to change our perspective to the changing reality. So instead, we continue to try and see the world as we think it should be. So we try to look at the world as it was or as we think it should be. I think you can see how in dogfighting, that's not going to work, right? You can't do that. You can't be like, oh, I wish the Russian fighter pilot was here. Like no, he's over there. You got to go get it, right? So you can't think about how things should be, and you can't think about how things were. Like oh, I wouldn't have got shot down because a second ago the fighter pilot, the guy I was fighting was there, and I was just operating off. No, like he moved. You need to move too. So you can see in that world how this makes perfect sense, but it makes sense for all of us too. This is from one of his biographers. His name's Grant Hammond. He said, ambiguity is central to Boyd's vision. Not something to be feared, but something that is a given. We never have complete and perfect information. And the best way to succeed, here's the key line, this is so good. The best way to succeed is to revel in ambiguity. I like the word revel. A couple weeks ago, we used the word embrace. I think we said embrace. Embrace the uncertainty. I think that's how we put it. Embrace the uncertainty. Because it's too much. You just have to embrace. And that's step one. And here he says right here, the best way to succeed is to revel in ambiguity. How do we do that? Well, that's the beginning of the OODA loop. Yesterday we talked about tribes. And when it comes to COVID, my advice is to not join a tribe. Tribes are good. They have a place. They're important at times. But I think in this circumstance, they can be a major hindrance because once you join a tribe, it can be very difficult to process new information and change your opinions or change your actions moving forward. You kind of get trapped in tribal thinking, which can be characterized by looking at the world how things should be or looking at the world as how things were and not how things are. And that's not good, right? We don't want to get trapped. Now is not a good time for that. So stay nimble, as John Boyd would when he is in a cockpit in a dogfight, staying nimble. He was always, and we must always be observing. That's the first one, observe. So in our context for COVID, it's taking in new studies, taking in new findings, new treatments. It's also dismissing a lot of stuff, right? Ridiculous headlines, fake news. There's this mini panic from a couple days ago that there's a mutated, more virulent strain that came from Europe. Fake news, absolute fake news. So you got to know, you got to shuffle through it, wade through all that stuff. But that's observing, always be observing. If you make up your mind, like we need to open up everything today, you've closed off your mind to new information. And that's not going to be helpful down the road. So always be observing. Again, as John Boyd would do when he was in a dogfight. So that's observe, orient. So he said you're always orienting. All right, so you observe, okay, and now you orient. What's the best course of action? Then decide. Right? You can't just be observing and orienting all day. Right? No this way, no this way, no this way. That's not gonna. So you got to decide. You got to decide what to do, and then act. Do it. And again, in this loop, you're always doing it. It's not just like a one-time thing. Oh, thanks, I did it. Thank goodness. You got to. And then once you act, you're constantly doing it. This is John Boyd himself. He said, under the OODA loop theory, every combatant observes the situation, orients himself, decides what to do, and then does it. If his opponent can do this faster, however, his own actions become outdated and disconnected to the true situation, and his opponent's advantage increases geometrically. So the first time we talked about the OODA loop was with Trump and the election in 2016, and how Trump was always first to everything. He was the first to execute the OODA loop all the time. He always did it faster than anyone ever. And everyone else, all the other candidates, whether the Republicans or Hillary Clinton and the media, they were always reacting to him. He was always in control of the dogfight. Constantly, the entire election. He controlled the media narrative 100% of the time during 2016. He always did the OODA loop faster than anyone else. You need to do that too. In this virus and moving forward, you always have to be faster than anyone else during the OODA loop. Never landing in one place forever. And this is such a tricky thing, and we're going to talk a lot more about this one tomorrow. I got to run here, but Boyd said, he said the Air Force has a doctrine, the Army's got a doctrine, the Navy has a doctrine. He's like, everybody's got a doctrine. But if you read my work, John Boyd said, doctrine doesn't appear in there once. And he said, you know why? Because it's doctrine on one day, and every other day it becomes dogma. That was his way of saying you got to stay agile. You have to be drown-proof calm, as I imagine John Boyd was in the cockpit, and you have to be John Boyd agile. Everyone who claims that they've made up their mind with 100% certainty no matter what, from this point moving forward, those are people who are going to fall behind. At one point, they will. Right? That Russian MiG, at one point, it may be in front of them, they may be in charge right now, but if they don't change their mind, that Russian MiG, that virus is going to be behind them, and it's going to get them. One way or the other, whether it's business-wise, whatever. Always be doing the OODA loop, and always do it faster than anyone else. If we can do it right, then we'll come out of it all stronger. Governor George Pataki, coming up next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. I want to go right to, he was my governor when I used to live in New York. George Pataki's got a new book, Beyond the Great Divide, How a Nation Became a Neighborhood. Governor, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Mike. Nice being on with you.
Nice to have you here. So let's chat about it. I love the idea of a neighborhood. I think we are seeing this. We're feeling this now in the midst of COVID, maybe more than ever, right? We're spending more time at home, more time on our front porches, maybe more time with our neighbors. And I hope people are enjoying that part of it. But you really got to feel it and see it during 9/11 when you were governor. So tell us about the difference. Like, what's the difference between just a nation and then a neighborhood?
You know, Mike, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, is to tell that story. You know, there were a great many people on September 10th, before the attacks, who couldn't stand New York. It was this arrogant alien city on the East Coast of America. And after September 11th, the whole country got to see that, hey, you know, they're Americans, they're good people. And those firefighters, those police officers, the construction guys, the New Yorkers, they're okay. And the whole nation rallied behind New York. And we were the most unified of my lifetime. There were no Republicans or Democrats, young or old, rich or poor, black or white. We were Americans, and we'd been attacked. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is because now we're the most divided we've been in my lifetime. It seems that if your lifelong friends think politically different than you can't be friends anymore. And how crazy is this? We learned on September 11th, we're all in it together. And perhaps one of the positives that can come out of this is we learn we're all in it together again. You know, so the things that divide us, that seem so important, in the face of this, really kind of melt away.
When did you, I want to talk about more of the good stuff in a second, but let's just get the bad part out. Like, why do you think it fell apart? like where did that attitude we had it for a good time, and then it split? What is it about, either like, was it a particular thing that happened, or do you think it's just human nature, or what was it that made us go back to our
Mike, I actually talked
divided
about
ways.
it. I don't think it's human nature. I think a lot of it is leadership. And we were united. And then we had a series of high profile events in Washington where people lost trust in their leaders. The first, I love President George W. Bush. He's a friend and I like him. But the decision to go into Iraq and to say it's all about weapons of mass destruction, and then to find out years later that Iraq didn't have any, that began the process of dividing the country. And then President Bush lost, and you had Barack Obama come in, and his first big thing is Obamacare. And love it or hate it, but he said at least a dozen times, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. It was untrue. And that gave rise 2 years later to the Tea Party. That was a reaction to our government having failed and lied to us again. So it's failed government leadership is a part of it, but then it's also academia. You have a great academic education, but it seems that between the media and academia, they are almost dictating an ideology that either you follow MSNBC or you follow Fox, and there's no middle ground. And we can't live that way. Most of the solutions generally are somewhere in the middle. So that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. Marginalize the extremes, solve the problems, bring Americans together, and there's nothing we can't accomplish.
I think that's true. Can you tell us a story, a moment of goodness that happened in just the maybe immediate or aftermath of 9/11 that you keep going back to in your heart as that's beautiful, we need more of that again?
There were just so many of them. And one of those, though, is we set up a family center for the family members who had lost a loved one on September 11th at the Javits Center on the west side of Manhattan. And I would go there. I'd be feeling down every now and then. You'd get death totals. We were hoping to recover some survivors, and there were very few. And then you'd go meet the family members who had lost a loved one, and they'd have a picture of their daughter or their son or their husband or their wife, and you'd see their strength. And they had lost their loved one, but they weren't going to let that break them. And it just was so inspiring. And then I tell the story how I go down alone without the press to Ground Zero, and every day there'd be 3 or 4 retired firefighters raking through the rubble, looking for the remains of their child who had died, who they hadn't found. And their courage, in trying to bring home their son or their daughter, is just something that to this day, when I think, well, maybe things are tough, I look at them and I go, how courageous were they? How inspiring were they? But Mike, there were thousands of stories like that. And I'm sure today with the coronavirus, there are thousands of stories of nurses and orderlies and doctors risking their lives and doing things to save others. And that's the greatness of America.
Amen. The one I go back to is the 9/11 boat lift, right? I'm sure you've seen that short little documentary about the Coast Guard asking for help and all the tugboats and everything coming in to get people off of the island. That's a beautiful moment for me among so many others. What's something that you don't think gets enough attention about 9/11 and maybe your and Giuliani and everybody's leadership working together? I don't want to say supply chains, but just like leadership, like hierarchy, like everything working together. What's a story about that you wish people would realize?
I tell the story of that day where Mayor Giuliani's command center was destroyed, and he was in communication and incommunicado for 4 or 5 hours. And around 1:30 in the afternoon, he called me and said, "George, I'm fine. I'm out from the rubble. We're setting up a temporary command center in Lower Manhattan." And I thought for a minute, and I said, "Rudy, I'll be right there." And I brought all my key players. And that afternoon, in this one big room around a conference table, you had Giuliani and all his team on one side, and myself and all my team on the other side. That evening, the feds, FEMA came in at the end of the table. We never missed a beat. We talked constantly, not just Rudy and I, but every single key official. And we had a seamless response that really helped us get through it. And that story isn't told. What are told are the stories like Katrina, where the federal government blamed the state blamed the city blamed the feds, and we had none of that. And now you hear de Blasio and Cuomo, the governor and the mayor, they don't even talk. The mayor will
Wow.
say the schools are being shut down, and then the governors say, hey, wait a second, the schools aren't being shut down. That's my decision. The story of how we worked so closely together at all levels of government, that's what we need now. We're not seeing that now, particularly between the city and the state of New York. And that's a story that I should lead to others to do this.
I'm so grateful for that. So what's your advice to leaders, and whether, I'm not telling you to speak to Cuomo and de Blasio, but just any leaders, like business leaders, families, like just communication. What's your advice on communication, and why does it break down?
First of all, it's not about you. You may have the title of governor or mayor or whatever, but it's not about you. It's about the people who need your leadership at a moment of crisis. And you have an obligation to set aside political history, personal animosity, anger towards something, and just do what's right. And to do what's right, you have to communicate. You have to let the people know what you're doing and why you're doing it. But it has to be a two-way communication. You have to listen to what others are saying, what they're going through, or what they need that you otherwise might not know. So communication is critical, but it's got to be two-way communication. You have to listen as well as speak, and cooperation at all levels. Set aside personal differences. Just do the job.
Governor, I want to say something here, and I want to know if it's offensive. I hope it's not. But it's interesting when you said it's not
already, Mike. Yeah.
When you said it's not about you. It's interesting. When I think of 9/11, the face of it, I think Giuliani and I guess Bush. I don't think George Pataki. But that's why I'm so interested to read this book, because obviously you were one of the integral leaders of the entire thing. But I think you did make it about other people and other bigger things than you. It wasn't look at me in the midst of all that. Is that fair? I mean, I was younger when it happened, but is that fair? Is that insulting, or is that a compliment?
That was a conscious decision I made. It was a conscious decision that we were going to all sit in the same room. It was a conscious decision that Rudy and I would have joint press conferences. He wouldn't have a press conference as the mayor, and then a half hour later, I'd have a press conference as the governor. We did it together. And it was, to me, it was all about sending a message of unity, that in this time of crisis, our past history, he had endorsed my opponent, campaigned for my opponent. It didn't matter. What mattered was doing what was right and making sure we all did what was right. So it was a conscious decision, and I'm proud of it. And I do speak about some of that in the book, because, that side of the story has never been told. And I think it's important for others, when they might be placed in a position of leadership, to understand, do your job. Do your job regardless of what it takes and who you have to work with. And if the cameras aren't on you, that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. It reminds me of the book Captain Class. You were that captain who didn't need the spotlight on him. And those are the best types of captains. Oh, that's wonderful, Governor. So I hope it was a compliment, not an insult. So I have a question about leadership, and I'm going to mention Cuomo, but again, I don't want any drama here. I'm not looking for sound bites. To attack the former governor attacks current governor. Not my intent here. But I was talking to a buddy of mine, and he said that Cuomo's doing a good job in terms of leadership style, because he can kind of play he has a couple different postures. So like at one point he's caring and compassionate, and in another second he's like a little more directive and like, we need to do this, and then sometimes he's inspirational. So he kind of has all these different leadership postures at one, and my buddy found that very effective. Can you speak to that, and how does one maybe take on a different leadership posture that maybe they weren't comfortable with? Or did you, during 9/11, have to be a different kind of leader at times that you've never been before?
Yeah, I think Governor Cuomo's doing a fine job with his briefings, and I think they're informative and they're helpful. But that's not the most important part of the job. And I don't want to get into criticism about what actually is happening in New York, but I think almost 5,000 nursing home deaths is a catastrophe that could have been avoided with the right leadership and the right policies. But I think it's not a change in style of leadership. You are who you are. And if you try to play a different role because you're in the midst of a crisis, you're probably not going to play that role well unless you're an actor. And, I've never been a very good actor. So I think you just have to be yourself, let the people see who you are, but understand that this is different. When you're in a crisis, it should always be about the people, but there's always politics and political office. Put that aside. during a crisis. And, that's why, like the mayor and the governor, they should be working together, talking together every day. Forget the politics. This is about a crisis and the people.
Yeah, good point. I got a big picture question for you, Governor, because I grew up in New York. I grew up in Syracuse and Skaneateles. And so we were upstate. I was just talking with our producer here. When I think of New York, I think of apple orchards and rolling hills and like lakes and right and dairy farms. When my friend here who grew up in California thinks New York, it's metropolis, density, the whole, right? How did you as a governor balance the two very different parts of the state? Same thing here in California where I live now, right? I live in San Diego, so you got LA and San Francisco dominating the state. But, the inland part is a totally different state in so many ways. How do you as a governor balance that?
Mike, I never had a problem with that, and I think it was because of my background. I grew up on a little farm in the Hudson Highlands, so I knew upstate intimately. I grew up upstate in a rural, semi-rural background, but then I went to law school in New York. I lived in New York. I worked in New York. I lived in the west side of Manhattan for years. So I got to know New York City extremely well, too. So I think that was a huge advantage for me as governor, that I knew the state. And I wasn't just someone from the city who thought the rest of the state was maybe the big toe or something to a body. And I wasn't an upstater who didn't understand how important the subways are to the lifeblood of New York City. So I never found that difficult. I think most of my predecessors and the people who followed me have found it very difficult. And I really am concerned about upstate New York now. I just don't think the policies are right for upstate, but hopefully that will change.
One last question for you, Governor. So this is something I've been exploring a lot. It's an old Aesop fable, the country mouse, the city mouse. I think this is one of the biggest divides in our country today, as it's been forever, and that's urban and rural, right? This is kind of what I'm getting at here. To go back to the theme of your book, which is being united, what is something that people who grew up in the country and people who grew up in the city, what's something that unites them that we can get behind?
That's why I called the book Beyond the Great Divide, because as I said, New York was this urban morass to the rest of the country. And then the country realized, hey, wait a second, this is a great place and has great people. I think what unites us is just the fact that we have a common destiny. You may live in the most rural community in Nebraska, but what happens in New York City is going to affect your life profoundly. Or you can live in the Bronx in a crowded high-rise apartment, but you're not going to have food if the rural part of America isn't thriving. And we saw that sense of unity on September 11th. And I have no doubt that with the right messaging, with people looking to bring people together as opposed to separate us, that we can achieve that again. I think, for all the divide in Washington, and it's horrible, we just saw them pass 3 bills, bipartisan bills, the $2.2 trillion stimulus program. There were things in there that I'm sure the Democrats didn't like. There were things in there I'm sure the Republicans didn't like. But they said, we're in a crisis. All right, we're going to marginalize the extremes. We're going to get it done. And that's what we have to do as a country. That we just have to understand that there isn't a rural future, there isn't an urban future, there's an American future. And we're all in this together, and let's come together and move beyond that great divide.
And that's right. Beyond the Great Divide, How a Nation Became a Neighborhood, new book from former Governor George Pataki, which means he's clearly running for something soon, right, Governor? You're back on the campaign trail?
Mike, right at the beginning, I say I'm writing this, and I'm not running for anything. It's just time to tell the story.
I'm grateful you did that, Governor. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
True story. Mike Slater, more coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I have 2 parting thoughts here that don't fit anywhere else in the show and don't necessitate a whole segment. So I'll fit 2 of them in here real quick. The first is on listening well and on thinking well and debating well. This is inspired by our conversation yesterday with Dave Rubin. Again, you can download our free app in the App Store. Just search for The First TV, and everybody, Buck, Dana, Jesse, me, all of our shows are right there. Just click the day, boom, you can watch it, scroll through, you can watch the Dave Rubin interview from yesterday's show. So I was thinking about it after we talked to him yesterday. There's a book by Daniel Dennett. It's called Intuition Pumps. Is that right? Intuition? Yeah, Intuition Pumps and other tools for thinking. So this is a philosopher, and he's got 4 principles for talking to someone with a different opinion. And I'm doing these a little bit out of order. But one of them is, you should list any points of agreement. I think the governor would support that one as well, right? Anywhere you agree, any common ground whatsoever, note it. Second thing, you should mention anything you've learned from this person you're talking with, right? So you guys totally disagree, but they say something, if you can find any point of agreement and anything that you've learned, like, oh, wow, like I didn't know that, or that's interesting, or like it's like anything like that totally puts their guard down is really important. The third one, I'll leave out for a second for dramatic effect. And the fourth one is, or he says, only after those 3 things are you permitted to say as much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. So here's the thing, no one follows those guidelines. All right, we always just rebuke and criticize immediately right away without finding any common ground and without recognizing that you've learned something if you have. There's another element here, which really reminded me of Dave Rubin. He said you should attempt to re-express this other person's position that they have so clearly that they say, wow, yes, I wish I thought of putting it that way. Like, yes, that's exactly what I was saying. And actually, that's even better than what I was saying. Thank you for, yeah, okay, yeah. And then you can criticize and rebuke. So that last point there, that's called the steel man. Have you ever heard of that? I've never heard of it before. The steel man. It's the opposite of a straw man. So a straw man is we take our opponent's argument and we build a straw man out of it. It's weak and we just punch it down and then we're like, oh, aren't we great? This is you build up your opponent's argument even stronger than they've made it. It's a steel man. And now when you crush it, it actually means something. You have to set up a steel man, or you should set up a steel man before you pose any criticism or rebuke or your argument. Interesting. I like that, huh? Oh, that's the first. Second, we've mentioned this a couple times kind of in passing, but I saw it twice yesterday, so I got to share it here. So this is from Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly is the founder of Wired magazine, and he turned 68 the other day, and he wrote out a nice blog post with 68 pieces of advice. And I've read through like half of them, and they're all pretty good, but this one really stood out. He said, when you're young, spend at least 6 months to 1 year living as poor as you can, owning as little as you possibly can, eating beans and rice in a tiny room or tent in order to experience what your worst lifestyle might be. That way, anytime you have to risk something in the future, you won't be afraid of the worst case scenario. So that's an ancient theme. Seneca used to say the exact same thing. One of his top pieces of advice, he would say, he wrote this to a friend, he said, appoint certain days on which to give up everything and make yourself at home with next to nothing. So like purposefully, like choose a couple days out of the year, more than just like going camping. But I think he goes into greater detail, like eat stale bread and gruel, just like barely survive for like a week every year. Start cultivating a relationship with poverty. How good is that line? How opposite is that from our American like goals of life? Like he says, cultivate a relationship. We're trying to avoid poverty as much as possible. We're trying to get as much as possible. And he says, cultivate a relationship with it. For no one is worthy of God, small g, unless he has paid no heed to riches. No one is worthy of greatness, in other words, unless you've paid no heed to riches. I am not, mind you, against your possessing them, but I want to ensure that you possess them without tremors, without fear, that you may lose them. And this you will only achieve in one way, by convincing yourself that you can live a happy life even without them, and by always regarding them as being on the point of vanishing. Are you, the things you own, the things you have, do you just cling to them and do everything you can to make sure you don't lose them? Or are you like, well, I'm grateful for these things, but they may go away. And this goes back to the beginning of the show, right? Like with Hamlet, right? Hamlet was complimenting Horatio that he had the proper balance of emotion and reason, and nothing knocked him off. Nothing knocked him down. Just took everything properly. Not cold and stoic and like ignoring reality, but just took it in and was never swayed by Lady Fortune. So it all comes around perfectly. Love that advice. And I think the people who've lived in poverty before, they don't want it. No one wants it. But they're not afraid of it. And I think people who have never been poor or lived in poverty are terrified that doing anything anything risky may lead to that, or just terrified that I may lose things and live in it. But you can make it through. That's my point of it. For a lot of people, COVID is, because so people, to make that point, again, people who have lived in poverty, they've made it through, right? And they know that they can again. They don't want to, but they could if they needed to. So there's no need to fear. But a lot of people, COVID is a worst case scenario. You'll make it through. True story, Mike Slater. See you tomorrow. Spread the word.